Go ahead and be seated. We will have just a couple of announcements. I believe there are a few, other than the fact that we did send out another mailing list, and that'll be the last one for the year. We tried to do the mailing list every 2 weeks. Sometimes we do it a little more frequently, depending on the urgency of the requests, but at minimum, every 2 weeks. I found after doing the mailings for more than 20 years now, that mailing at the end of the year is, I could say, a little annoying, trying to get to the post office, and there's a lot of people sending out packages for their, holidays, celebrations, and in any case, I've tried to have a pattern, okay, I'll do it on this day, and then don't go back to the post office until after the season is over. Of course, if there's something urgent, we will get it out, but usually those things can wait until after the first of the year. So regarding this time of year and the offering of the booklet in the telecast, The Truth About Christmas, we have a whole series of booklets regarding the series of holidays that all came from pagan sources. So it actually begins previous to Christmas, which is Halloween, and so it begins at that time, and then it moves into what is now called Christmas, which came from the Saturnalia. But then there's also included in that festival was the New Year's celebration, which we have a booklet on, The Truth About New Year's. It moves into other holidays such as Epiphany, Lent, and Ash Wednesday. And we have a booklet about that, which involves the Mardi Gras, which is another Bacchanalian festival, as mentioned by the Puritan John Prine. It moves into another pagan holiday about was once known as the Lupercalia. Now it's known as Valentine's Day, so we have the shocking truth about Valentine's Day. Then, of course, it goes on into Easter, so we have the Truth About Easter booklet, and also, if you want to dig deeper into that subject, we have Easter or Passover. Which one should we keep? I mean, I think the answer is clear to all of us, but it's good to be reminded of those things. And it seems like every time I do a program, I dig a little deeper and find more information that can be added that's just kind of interesting, such as an extensive amount presented in the telecast today about Krampus, the dark helper of Sinterklaas. And in any case, hopefully you found that interesting, and you can begin to see other connections as you see other things that are used during this time of year, whether in America or in other parts of the world. You start to see little things that go like, oh, I know where that came from now. I can tell. I can make a connection and put the pieces together. So hopefully it's helpful to us in that way, and hopefully there are others that will see it and it will be helpful to them as well. Got to get another hat on and move into the sermon now for the message today. Let's go ahead and begin by turning over to Genesis 3. The message is going to be a little shorter today since we had a telecast that was almost 30 minutes long, so I intentionally picked a topic that I think would fit more of like a split sermon type of a length for the message today, the main message. So I had read a comment this past week made by a Catholic priest who had said that the hearing of confessions from a nun is kind of like being stoned to death with popcorn. I don't know if you are putting the pieces together, but it's, the sins of a nun are fairly weak, so to speak. They're supposed to be some of the most temperate people on the planet, but even people like that have sins to a degree. We all have sin, and sin is defined as the transgression of the law, and the laws of God are many. There are more than 600 mandates in the Torah. Many of those laws apply only to the priesthood, and many were also given specifically to a nation under God, a nation established by God under his rule. And of those laws, there are, interestingly, 365 prohibitions that begin with you shall not or thou shalt not, ... And there are 248 commands beginning with you shall. And many people view the you shall commands or commandments as more positive. In my opinion, they are both positive because they all relate to the 10 categories of law found in the 10 commandments. And so any violation of those moral disciplines is considered transgression and therefore sin. So sin, this can be traced all the way back to the beginning of humanity, to something that's called the original sin, and that term is referring to what Eve had done in the Garden of Eden when she chose to take from some fruit from the forbidden tree, and this tree, God had declared it to be off limits, strictly off limits. And she chose to violate his command. And let's go ahead and read that, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 3, where it says that the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the eternal God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the tree of which is in the midst of the garden, fruit of that tree, God said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, unless you die. And so he gave her an opportunity to give him a little lesson, as if he did not know. And then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die, for God knows in the day that you eat of this tree, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So this is not just knowing what is good and evil, but recognizing evil as something that's viable. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, for it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave it to her husband with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both of them were opened, which is talking about the mind, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. So the brevity of retelling what had happened during this infamous event called by some, labeled by some as the original sin, it makes it appear as though everything happened rather quickly here. From the beginning of creation and forward, people think that this did not take very long. I mean, we go from God creating the universe and also then the earth and everything, all the life that we know today only took 7 days to do that. And then he gave Adam and Eve rules to live by. And then then we have the original sin. And the briefness of these first chapters of the Bible have caused many to think that Eve, she must have been very immature, not very knowledgeable, not much experience in life, and perhaps quite young. Even some would refer to as having a childlike mind, not able to really understand what she was doing. And of course, Adam, her husband, not being much brighter than Eve. Now, both of them lacking the wisdom that comes with age, that comes with experience. And, that might be true, but I suggest only in part. Only in part. I do have somewhat of a different perspective of how this likely played out, because I see God as creating man and creating the woman and giving them intellect and also giving them instruction and then time, a period of time to understand the meaning of life, to understand a good work ethic and responsibility. And so I think they probably lived in the garden for not just days, but perhaps months, maybe even longer before the original sin. So the time frame that is mentioned in these first chapters of the Bible the time frame is not mentioned in these first chapters of the Bible. And so leads people to think it didn't take very long, that it all happened very quickly. But I suggest do not let the succinctness that is found here influence the period that we believe this took place, because the Bible frequently moves from one period of time to another, and sometimes it'll just use very simple terms like in the process of time, or it came to pass, and years had gone by. So this leads me to wonder, could there have been other conversations that took place between Eve and the serpent prior to this moment where she took from the fruit and she ate of it and then brought it to her husband? Could this actually just be a summary of the dialogue that took place during some of these conversations? Because consider for a moment, would God, who is faithful, allow an immature young woman to face the wiles of the devil without an understanding of what she was doing, of what some of the consequences would be? I suggest that he would not, because after all, I mean, think about it. This was going to set the course for all of human history. This is a huge deal. Surely he would have given her knowledge and time, a period of time to at least be mature enough to make what is a grown-up decision, not something that a child should have to face. So my thought is that Adam and Eve, that they were given a measure of intellect, that they were very bright, that they were given instruction. I believe that they did understand a great deal about life, about right and about wrong. Now, whether or not they had the Spirit of God, that is arguable. And of course, that would lead to further speculation. But that's not the point that I want to make today. My point is that this original sin of Eve, that this was likely something that was not done rashly. I suggest that Eve did not impulsively, just in a single conversation, all of a sudden decide, I think I'm going to do that. That sounds like a good idea. And, this is serious. This is a huge, serious matter. I mean, first of all, disobeying her husband, who would have agreed with God, saying, no, that we stay away from that tree. We don't go over there. So she would disobey her husband, and even worse, disobey a direct command from their Creator. So it's more likely that Eve had time to consider the tree, perhaps even to admire the tree from a distance, to look at its fruit and to see, I don't know, it looks pretty good. It doesn't look poisonous, She may have even imagined about this, meditated on it for moments occasionally throughout her days and weeks of doing work in the garden, imagining what life would be like if she ate of its fruit and the further benefits that it might bring her. Being human, she was designed to be human, so she was flesh and blood like the rest of us. So it's also probable that this conversation recorded in Genesis is only a summary of what took place. After all, we do know that the author, he had written the inspired account after he had spent decades in Egypt being schooled in the most prestigious halls of education at that time. Moses, he had access to libraries in Egypt and history of mankind going all the way back to the time of Noah. Now, along with the many tales that he would have been able to read of tales of myth and legend, there would have been material records of actual events, things that did occur. And so God, it's my belief God led Moses. He led him to know, to be able to discern what was true and what was fiction. And during my studies of the book of Genesis, I found a minimum of 7 verses and likely more than a dozen others indicating that Moses was in fact relating information that came from previous generations, that he was recalling things that he had learned and put it down in the Torah. I think God gave Moses the ability the opportunity, I should say, to learn, to be educated, and the ability to understand what really happened. What really happened from the time of Adam all the way to the time of Jacob. And then he inspired Moses to produce a book, a series of books. You know, they're divided into 5 books now, but some books that are called the Torah, so that they could be handed down from generation to generation, and we would have fact and not myth and legend. Now, of course, this course of Moses writing the Torah, this too is my impression of how it came to exist, is also considered speculation. I believe there is evidence for it, but I would still admit that it is somewhat speculative. But when we consider the situation, and when we consider, the human thought process when it comes to what Eve had experienced, the education that would be necessary, and having a period of time to know, some of the consequences that she might face, or in her case, what the benefits would be, and to apply the things that they were learning, both Adam and Eve, to see what works and what doesn't. It just makes sense that this would have, God would have allowed this to take place before he would have allowed the serpent to tempt her in this way. So let's go to James 4, if you will. The speculation I have about Eve premeditating the original sin, it matches previous thoughts that every human being has before they do something that is wrong. And in the context of what we are talking about, before they transgress the moral law of God. And although admittedly, sin is often something that is done impulsively. All of us have committed sins on a whim, if you will. Some of them may be considered mistakes if we didn't exactly know what we were doing beforehand. We may have been faced with something suddenly, and human nature desires to avoid pain or consequence, and we seek instead pleasure, to be comforted. And so we have, in the past, all of us have made hasty decisions, and we have taken the broad way, we have taken the wide gate, instead of choosing the more difficult path that might give us some discomfort, some pain, or a consequence. However, the vast majority of sins are, I suggest, premeditated to a degree. And I don't mean planned out for hours or days. I just mean we thought about it more than once before the sin was committed. We do this. We might think something is wrong, and then perhaps we are certain at some point, but then we start to have a little bit of uncertainty because it's something we want. It's something we want to enjoy or have, but it crosses our mind, more than a few times beforehand. And if we keep mulling it about in our mind, here and there. I'm not saying for hours at a time, but just, we'll think about it a little bit, then go about our day and move on. A couple days later, we'll think about it again. We'll move on. A week later, we think about it again, and we'll sometimes begin to allow room for doubt, to wonder, is it really sin? Is it really something that we should avoid? And eventually, if we keep doing that, we'll compromise. We will compromise to the point of transgression. We've all done this. I have done it. I know we all have. Of course, perhaps we're not convinced that it's a sin, and at that time, and that's due to conciliation. It's in our nature to not be safe rather than sorry when it comes to moral disciplines. And we might degrade the sin. Perhaps we think, well, it's really not that bad, and God's not going to hold it against me because it's not grievous. Or, perhaps he'll wink at it as he does to some during times of ignorance. And it reminds me of another story of 3 preachers who went on a fishing trip, and they were not catching any fish. So one of them said to the others, hey, it might be a good idea to take a little time to confess our worst sins to each other and then pray about it. And they all agreed. And so the first man said that his biggest sin was that he would occasionally go down to the beach and he liked to watch the women in bikinis. The second man said that his biggest sin was occasionally having one too many glasses of wine. The third preacher said, my biggest sin is gossiping. You get it? Now that he knows what the sins of the first two are, I'm going to go tell those to other people. Well, this story may not be true, but it makes a good point, because no matter who we are, in the church, in the family, in the community, no matter who we are, we all have had sin, and we all compromise sometimes and allow ourselves to experience a measure of sin because it's something that we enjoy. If sin was not enjoyable, nobody would do it. And the compromise that we make sometimes, it's not a rash decision. We premeditate it, we think about it, we reason. And then we choose to follow through. Think about things like David. King David, it wasn't a rash thing where he took Bathsheba and had sex with her. That was not something done suddenly. He saw her. He admired her from a distance, probably for a number of days before he followed through with that. Moses, he was educated in the most prestigious empire of the world at that time, the most powerful, the best education, and yet he knew murder was wrong, especially in Egypt. They're going to kill you, and yet he followed through. He killed the Egyptian taskmaster anyway. Now, there are numerous sins in the Bible, both major and minor, that were known by the sinner to be a sin before the transgression. And this continues to be the case today, doesn't it? Even in the Church of God. In addition to this, no matter how major or minor we might think the sin is, a degree of sin, because you have to admit there are sins that are worse than others, but all sin violates the law. All sin required the death of Jesus through crucifixion. And so even failing to do what we know is right is considered a sin. You can put it in the category of you shall laws, those you shall commandments. In James 4, in verse 17, it says, therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him or her, I would add, it is sin. There's a saying that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And that, of course, refers to societal influence for the most part. And it leads me to wonder, where are the Charlie Kirks in the Church of God today? That's another topic. But the adage is, it's also true individually, for each of us personally within our own lives. Because when we learn what is right, it is up to us to take a step further and to actually do what is good, do the good. If we do not, then evil prevails. It allows us to compromise. We think about things that we understand our transgressions, and well, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's not really a transgression at all. I mean, God's going to wink at it. Revelation 22 and verse 14 says, blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life. In other words, salvation is earned. We have to have the right to the tree of life. And how do we get that right? By doing his commandments, keeping his commandments. Not just in your heart, but actually following through with the hand. So knowing the commandments is one thing. That's very good to know what the commandments are, but doing them is far better. Contrary to common thought, ignorance is not bliss, because it will still result in a transgression or a number of transgressions that may or may not be held to our charge. And so the point is, premeditation, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to plot and scheme to commit a felony or a crime. Misdemeanors are included in this, and neither of them means that we need to spend hours of planning and thinking about it before we follow through. We might just think about it briefly, move on, think about it a time later, and move on, and think about it here a couple times here and there, several maybe, before we proceed. That is likely what Eve did before she committed the original sin. She likely thought about that tree and its fruit several times or more throughout her days of doing her work, throughout weeks, months maybe, thoughts about that tree, how attractive the fruit was, and the benefits she might get. And then eventually she chose to take and eat. Adam, he probably had many thoughts about the tree as well. And perhaps he had a little more temperance for a period of time. But apparently neither one of them had a firm position about the tree. Maybe they did initially when God said, stay away from it. Don't even touch it. Don't go near it. And they said, yes, sir. We will not do that. And so my impression is that compromise came at some point. It wasn't just all of a sudden, just like though the next day, now they're confronted and here we go. Let's look at another example in Ezekiel 28. Ezekiel 28. There is something else to consider when it comes to premeditated or the premeditated original sin. To be precise, Eve's sin was not the original one. It was not the first sin recorded in the Bible. There was another who sinned before that, long before that. And this sin was not only just as significant, if not more, it was even more severe, even worse than what Eve had done. It was the transgression of a glorious angel known as Lucifer, which is a term meaning morning star. Now Ezekiel, this great prophet, he recorded a prophecy given to him by God about a king of Tyre. And it's interesting, I looked into this yesterday, dove a little deeper into this subject, and Tyre comes from the word Tsor. It's spelled T-S-O-R for some who like to know how to spell those Hebrew or foreign terms. So it's pronounced Tsor, T-S-O-R, and that means a rock or stone. Now, there was a place of Tyre that was kind of like an island off the coast, just not very far off the coast. And so that name refers to that place. But it's interesting that Tsor could be referring to a more general place, because the Earth is the third planet from the sun, and some call it the third rock from the sun. There was actually a sitcom with that title, and I don't forget, was that in the 80s or 90s? I don't remember. I only saw a few clips. Apparently it was quite funny. But Revelation 9 and verse 11 says that the wicked angels have a king over them. And so it's interesting that in this prophecy that God gave the prophet Ezekiel, that there is a portion in Ezekiel 28 and even beforehand that does refer to the actual island or place of Tyre, but we see that when it moves on, and it calls him a prince of Tyre, and then it moves forward and it says a king of Tyre or the rock. And the king is clearly representative of Lucifer. And we can see this in the first sentence describing him in Ezekiel 28 and verse 12. It says, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty. Is this a description of a man? Clearly not. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Was the prince of Tyre, that island, in the Garden of Eden? No. Every precious stone was your covering, the sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald with gold. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. Clearly talking about a glorious, magnificent spirit being created by God, given a high position of authority, beautiful and wonderful. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. And mountain is a term that symbolically refers to government. So this is saying you had a part in the government of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of the fiery stones, which is a reference to God's throne, shown in Revelation 4 and verse 3. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. So God did not put that iniquity there, but he noticed it, he saw it, it was found in you. Something changed within this being. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence from within, and you sinned. And therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, no place in his government any longer, and I destroyed you, or will destroy you, covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stone. So he took him out of the position. That position was eliminated, and he was cast to the earth. And Jesus later said that I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. So indicating he was there when this took place. He saw it happen firsthand. So the question is, did the wise, mature, talented, glorious, and beautiful Lucifer, did he sin hastily? Did he get up one day and say, you know what, I'm not really happy. I'm going to form a plan and I'm going to try to take over God's throne? No. It says that there was an abundance of trading before he became filled with violence. So he trafficked iniquity. He likely went around talking to other angels, perhaps offering them positions of authority in his new government, which he was planning. Maybe he said, I'll give you planets, or you're going to have some other perks if you join the rebellion. Now, clearly, the trafficking that he did, it was spreading discontent. Are you happy here? Are you happy with this position? Because you can have more. There's more to be had out there, but God's holding you back. He's suppressing you. Same kind of argument that he gave to Eve. Oh, really? Is it that bad? Because, well, God's holding something back from you. There's something to be gained from doing this. So other angels also thought about this for some time, and eventually plans were made. They made plans for the insurrection. And it's safe to say that there were definitely times of great anger. And the anger swelled within the devil and other angels until eventually they believed that it's possible. We can actually overthrow God, our creator. That's what they thought. It's an irrational thought. Of course, we think and go, that's crazy talk. You could never do anything like that. But they thought they could do it, that it could succeed. So the violence described is within the devil, it's not just thoughts, I think it's deeds. Things that were carried out, things that were contrary to God's moral code. Irrational thoughts, of course, frequently lead to uncontrolled anger, and uncontrolled anger lead to irrational thoughts. And anger is, in fact, a result of dissatisfaction left unchecked. And I learned recently a great deal about this from a short documentary about how anger can cause long-term changes in the human body that can affect our health for years to come and actually affect the time that we have to live. So it's safe to say that Lucifer, he became very angry, and it was left unchecked to the point that where he had irrational thoughts that this might actually work. 1 John 2, so his was the original sin. Before Eve was Lucifer. And the type of anger that is experienced leading to irrational thought, it's not the same that God feels. God does not lose control of rational thought. The anger that he feels of what that's described in the Bible is when he's very displeased with what people are doing. So I think it's better described as displeasure. Also, anger to a point of irrational thought is not what Paul spoke of when he said to be angry and do not sin. Basically, Paul was saying, don't be satisfied with sin. You got to be dissatisfied with it, and you need to do something about it. Don't let the sin go. Don't let the sun go down in your wrath. And I'll be the first to admit that I have done this sometime in the past. I've let the sun go down on my wrath, and it's not a good feeling. You don't go to bed feeling good. You don't wake up feeling good. Your day does not go well. It hurts, and it doesn't just hurt the mind; it hurts the body as well. Now, I was going to mention more about anger that I got information I got from the documentary I had watched, but I think that's something that's better left for another time. An ancient philosopher that lived during the time of Jesus, he wrote that anger is an acid that does more harm to the vessel in which it is stored than to anything on which it is poured. So somehow the ancients knew, without the ability to see the inner workings of the brain and heart like modern science can, that anger hurts the person more than it hurts the people around that person. And this has something to do with premeditation and the original sin, whether of the devil or of Eve. See, the devil, it's clear to me that he ruminated on this, on his discontent, for some time before he made plans. And his rumination, it corrupted his mind. It led to irrational thought. Reason faded. And think about how it changed this being. He was once called glorious and beautiful and talented, and he's later described as deceptive and destructive, a serpent and a dragon. Eve, she did something similar. She may not have gotten angry, but she was dissatisfied, and I believe she thought about it more than once. And she wasn't content with what God had offered her and her husband, the life and the garden, and she saw the forbidden tree as something that was beyond what God had given her. So she reasoned. She lost rational thought in this, and she thought this tree, it might improve my life. It might improve my livelihood. And the point is, both of these original sins, they were not the result of a single conversation or rash behavior. They were not committed on a whim. The devil, he planted a seed within Eve, and they both encouraged that seed to grow until Eve finally followed through. Adam, he may have been thinking about it for some time as well. It doesn't say, we don't know, but it's likely he had thoughts about it, because when it was introduced to him, and we don't know if she introduced it more than once, if he just took it right away and went yes, or if maybe he said, no, I don't know, that's not a good idea, I'm not going there. Maybe she brought it to him on more than one occasion. We don't really know. But Eve sinned first. How long before Adam ate of the fruit is not known. Could have been minutes, I admit. but it may have been hours, it may have been days, we don't know. The consequence of doing that was not considered deeply enough. They understood there would be a consequence because God told them there would be a consequence. But they didn't think, well, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe we can deal with this. But even sins that you and I might consider not be that bad, they can be serious. They can be very serious because they begin with that idea that it's not that bad. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's okay. Maybe God will let it pass. And the compromise can be thought out. And it's all related, therefore, to our carnal existence, isn't it? Yeah, it's all related to our existence, not as God, but as his creation, because that's what Eve had in mind when she took and ate of that fruit. She thought, oh, I can be like God? Yeah, I want to be like God. That's what Lucifer thought in the original sin. I want to be like God. Yeah. They were dissatisfied with what God had given them, which is much more, as I've heard someone say many times, much more than I deserve, better than I deserve. So what this world has to offer, what the things that can be experienced or enjoyed, is attractive to us being human beings. It's attractive to our nature, which is why John had wisely written in 1 John 2 and verse 15, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, it doesn't mean you can't enjoy the things in the world. It means don't fall in love with it. Don't make the things in the world your passion, your motivation, what drives you, what influences you to make the decisions in life, moral decisions. Do not let the things of the world guide you in that way, because all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away. Yeah, it's degrading in more ways than one. It's corrupt, and it will pass away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God will abide forever. So every sin there is related to one or more of these three things, and they all play in our minds. A desire for pleasure, lust of the flesh, a motivation to seek what is pleasing to the eye, lust of the eye, and of course, pride that leads to compromise, feed the ego to satisfy some of these senses. And this results in a collapse of character. A collapse of character comes from compromise. Like was said in the sermon last week, a quote that is attributed to Thomas Jefferson, who said, "Men as well as rivers grow crooked by following the path of least resistance." It's more difficult to do what is right than to choose what is wrong. But choosing the narrow way, the straight gate, as Christ described it, though more difficult than giving into temptation, satisfaction of the flesh, the eye, or pride, choosing the narrow path is going to lead to much longer lasting, far greater satisfaction. It's going to produce humility, and humility, interestingly, is a great way to reduce dissatisfaction and anger, and instead to encourage temperance and faith and other fruits of the Spirit. So let's consider the possibility that Eve, like the devil, that they thought about this sin over time, they reasoned with it, and don't let thoughts like that take hold in your mind. Because when they come, what we should do instead is take control of our thoughts, take Paul's advice, and focus on things that are noble, things that are just, things that are pure and lovely and of good report. There are good things to consider in the world. There is still virtue in the world. There will always be a measure of virtue in the world. It may not always be right at our fingertips, but it is there. And guess what? those praiseworthy things, the goodness that can be found in the world, you are a part of that. You're a part of the good. Be content with that. Be hopeful in that. Meditate on these things. And do not give place to devilish thoughts. For the final hymn today, we will turn to page 70. And those who are sitting, rise, and we will sing A Servant's Prayer, page 70.